Hi, welcome back to Last Memories. I always think of amusement parks as places people go to escape reality. But after researching these cases, I couldn't look at rides the same way. From an influencer who attempted a backflip and slammed his head into the moving platform to a man whose spinal cord got squashed during a seemingly routine ride. It was the evening of August 8, 2016, at a large theme park in San Antonio, Texas. One of the most popular attractions was a giant pendulum ride that swung riders high into the air while rotating at the same time. Leandro Antonio Vance was 29 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. He worked as a freelance video editor and spent much of his free time making videos for social media. He was not a major creator, but had built a loyal audience that enjoyed watching him test unusual ideas and challenge common assumptions. Friends described him as creative and determined. When he got interested in something, he would spend days researching it before acting on it. Sometimes that research helped him create good content. Other times it made him too confident in conclusions that were missing something important. Earlier that summer, Leandro became fascinated by giant pendulum rides and spent weeks watching videos of them from different angles. Some people filmed themselves standing nearby while the rides operated. Others talked about the powerful wind created as the pendulum passed at the bottom of its arc. The videos gave Leandro an idea. He wanted to film himself standing as close as safely possible to one of the rides while it was running. He spent several weeks planning what he believed would be a controlled experiment. He studied layouts, visited parks to observe the rides, and eventually came up with what he thought was a smart safety system. He bought a climbing harness and a heavy-duty bungee cord. His plan was to wear the harness and attach the cord to a solid structure behind him so that if he slipped or lost his balance, the tether would stop him before he could drift too close to the ride. Several friends told him the safety barriers and warning zones around those attractions existed for a reason. Leandro told them he was not planning to enter the ride's path and that the tether would give him an extra layer of protection. He was convinced the setup was sound. On August 8th, he arrived at the park with his camera and equipment. He spent time watching the pendulum ride operate before crossing into a restricted maintenance area not intended for guests and positioning himself closer to the attraction. He attached the bungee cord to a concrete structure behind him, secured the harness around his waist, checked the connection several times, and started recording. And I want to be clear about something. He did not walk in recklessly. He spent weeks on this. That level of preparation is exactly what made him so confident nothing could go wrong. At first, it went exactly as he planned. He spoke to the camera while the ride swung back and forth behind him. Each pass sent a noticeable rush of air across the area, and the closer the pendulum came to the bottom of its arc, the stronger the force felt. He seemed pleased and kept filming as the ride reached full speed and the swings grew larger. At some point, Leandro shifted his position slightly to get a better camera angle, and in doing so, left more slack in the tether than he had started with. The extra cord settled loosely across the ground between him and the ride. He did not notice. As the ride continued operating, the loose section of cord slipped into the clearance zone beneath it. All I can say here is that no content is worth your life. People watch and go. You are stuck with your consequences. On the next pass, a moving part of the ride caught the cord, pulling it tight instantly. The force yanked Leandro off his feet and dragged him across the ground toward the attraction. He had no time to react before he was pulled into the restricted zone and struck a metal support structure. Witnesses saw him lunge forward suddenly and immediately shouted for help. Ride operators activated an emergency shutdown and staff rushed to the area. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported Leandro to a nearby hospital. He had suffered severe blunt force traumatic injuries from being dragged into the ride structure. Despite emergency treatment, he died later that evening. The medical examiner ruled his death the result of fatal blunt force traumatic injuries. Investigators found no mechanical failure and concluded that Leandro's homemade tether became entangled with the moving ride, causing the incident. His video recording ended during the event and was collected as evidence.
It was May 30th, 2018, and Memorial Day weekend in North Texas was living up to its reputation. The temperature had climbed into the mid-90s by afternoon, with that thick humidity that makes the air feel like you're breathing through cotton. Arlington sits in the heart of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and holiday weekends bring crowds from all over looking for ways to beat the heat. The local amusement parks were packed, parking lots full of cars from Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Let me tell you about Mara Gleck. Mara was 52 years old and worked in an office, the kind of steady administrative job that keeps businesses running but doesn't make headlines. She had come to the park that day with her adult son, and from what I've learned, this wasn't something she did often. Mara wasn't the thrill-seeker type, but it was a holiday weekend. Her son wanted to spend time together, and sometimes you say yes to things that push you outside your comfort zone. This is the part that bothers me the most. I think most of us have been in that moment where we agree to something we're unsure about just because we love the person asking. They had been walking around most of the afternoon when they approached an inverted roller coaster. This was one of those rides where your feet dangle and you're suspended beneath the track as it loops and corkscrews through the air. There were warning signs posted at the entrance about heart conditions, high blood pressure, and other health concerns, the kind most people glance at and keep walking. Now here's what makes this case different. Earlier that day, operators had noticed the train returning to the station a little faster than it usually did. Not dramatically faster, not enough to trigger a shutdown, but fast enough to stand out compared to normal cycles. A control reset was performed, and the ride continued operating. After the reset, the train was still considered operable, but it stayed near the upper edge of its normal range. Mara climbed into the front row and secured her shoulder harness. The restraint clicked into place, the safety checks were completed, and the train left the station with a full load of riders. For the first part of the ride, everything felt normal. The slow climb up the lift hill, that moment of anticipation at the top, and then the drop. The coaster accelerated down the first drop and entered the first loop at what witnesses later described as high speed. When you go through inversions, your body experiences G-force. The faster you're moving, the more force your body has to handle. And at 52, with a job that kept her sitting at a desk most days, Mara's cardiovascular system wasn't conditioned for that kind of stress. During the second inversion, riders nearby noticed her head drop forward inside the harness. Her body had gone limp. The train continued through the remaining elements, completing the cycle before returning to the station. When the harnesses unlocked, her body fell forward onto the platform. Staff immediately began CPR, but she wasn't breathing and had no pulse. She was transported to a nearby hospital where she was pronounced dead. The investigation showed the train had completed the course slightly quicker than usual, not a failure, but faster than routine operation. The medical examiner determined Mara suffered cardiac arrest during the high G portions of the ride. Investigators believed the stress of the ride, combined with the slightly higher speed and her own condition, likely pushed her body past its limit. And here's what bothers me about this case. The warning signs were there. The operators knew the train was running faster than they normally saw. They reset it and kept it running because it was still allowed to operate. But those limits are based on average, healthy adults. They don't account for a 52-year-old office worker who maybe hadn't seen a doctor in a while. Park management received a citation for continuing operation after earlier speed complaints. The coaster reopened after inspection, but the incident showed the gap between what's mechanically safe and what's safe for every rider. Mara was just trying to spend time with her son on a holiday weekend. The system worked the way it was designed to, but it was already running a little harder than usual, and for her, that was enough. It was August 23, 2014, in San Antonio, Texas. The city amusement park got its biggest crowds on Saturday evenings, and by late afternoon, the line for the main ride stretched far past the entrance to the ride area. Alina Torres, 25, worked as a teacher at a primary school. She had spent most of the afternoon walking around the park with her husband, Marcus. The two were marking their 5th wedding anniversary. She had stayed away from roller coasters for most of her adult life, but at some point in the past year, she had written a short list of things she wanted to do before she turned 30. Riding a fast coaster was near the top of it. she decided to get in line with her husband later that day. The coaster was the park's main attraction. Its 6-car trains launched riders from a full stop to nearly 70 miles per hour in just a few seconds. And I want you to hold that number, 70 miles per hour from a dead stop, because it becomes very important in a moment. During maintenance on the ride the night before, a technician removed a small bolt from a component that secured part of the guide rail. The bolt was reinstalled, but it had not been fully tightened. Investigators later determined that vibration from overnight testing gradually loosened the hardware, until it eventually dropped into a narrow gap beside the launch rail. Earlier the next morning, the ride's control system briefly registered a warning from a sensor near the launch track. The alert cleared after the system was reset, and the coaster completed several empty test runs without repeating the error. The warning was recorded in the maintenance log, and the ride continued operating through the afternoon without further problems. From here, it gets interesting. By early evening, Marcus and Alina were seated in the middle rows of the train. 2 operators walked down the platform, pressing firmly on each lap bar, while another gave the final signal to dispatch. A moment later, the train rolled slowly out of the station. The train stopped briefly on the launch track while the system prepared the launch. Then the motors engaged and the train accelerated forward. Only seconds into the launch, the smooth motion suddenly broke. The train jolted violently, throwing riders hard against their restraints as the launch aborted, and the train slowed much faster than expected. Screams erupted from several rows as the train shuddered and ground to a stop on the track. Operators in the control booth immediately radioed the park's emergency team. Staff and medical crews reached the train within minutes and began assisting riders out of their seats. Marcus had been thrown forward during the sudden stop, leaving him with broken ribs and a concussion. Alina had taken the worst of the impact when her head struck the restraint frame beside her seat during the sudden stop. She was rushed by ambulance to a nearby hospital, where doctors attempted emergency surgery. Alina Torres died from her injuries 2 days later, and for a trip that started as a 5th anniversary celebration, that's an ending that's hard to process. The ride was eventually shut down immediately, while investigators examined the launch track and reviewed the ride's maintenance records. During the inspection, they discovered a loose bolt near a guide component along the launch rail. Officials later determined that the loose hardware had triggered a fault in the launch system, causing the system to abort the launch and rapidly decelerate the train. The coaster remained closed while the park conducted a full safety review. It was June 11, 2018. At a Western theme park in Arizona, temperatures climbed toward 100 degrees as families crowded the park's water attractions. Among them was a vintage log flume ride winding through artificial rock formations, offering visitors relief from the intense desert heat. Tabit Fay was a 28-year-old delivery driver who spent most of his days navigating long routes across the Phoenix metro area. Co-workers described him as easygoing, but also someone who enjoyed getting laughs by doing things that were slightly reckless. During breaks at work, he often tried to make routine days more entertaining by doing things that pushed his luck a little too far. On a rare weekday off, Tabit joined several co-workers for a day at the park. With the desert heat climbing toward 100 degrees, the group quickly gravitated toward the water rides, turning the afternoon into a running challenge over who could get the most soaked before leaving. By the time they reached the log flume, Tabit had already decided he wanted to win that contest. While waiting in line, he insisted the front seat never produced a big enough splash and suggested he could make it better. When the group finally boarded the boat, he loosened his lap belt and scooted forward in the seat so he could lean out over the front during the drop. His co-workers warned that the ride operator would likely stop the ride if he tried anything risky, but Tabit ignored the warnings and stayed leaned forward, focused on getting as drenched as possible when the boat hit the splash basin. The group boarded a 4-seat fiberglass log boat, with Tabit taking the front seat for the best view of the 40-foot drop. As the boat drifted through the winding flume toward the conveyor lift, he continued shifting forward in his seat, resting his arms along the sides of the boat as if preparing to lean out during the splash. The conveyor carried the boat steadily to the top. From the peak, riders could see the park stretching across the desert before the log tipped forward and began its descent down the chute. As the boat raced down the drop and approached the splash basin, Tabit leaned forward and sideways over the bow, attempting to stretch his arm into the water for the biggest possible splash. The sudden surge of water and rapid deceleration at the bottom of the chute jerked the boat violently. Because he was already leaning outside the seat, the jolt threw Tabit partially out of the front of the log. His torso slid over the bow and into the narrow space between the fiberglass boat and the metal guide rail along the side of the flume as the log slammed into the splash trough. The boat continued drifting forward for several feet before wedging against the guide rail along the side of the channel. With his body trapped between the rigid fiberglass bow and the metal guide rail along the side of the flume, Tabit was pinned tightly in the narrowing space. Seconds later, the next boat descended the drop and struck the stalled log from behind. The impact pushed the first boat forward in the channel, compressing Tabit further between the boat and the metal guide rail. Guests along the walkway began shouting as ride operators stopped the lift conveyor to prevent more boats from entering the splash basin. Staff rushed down a maintenance path and worked to separate the boats while emergency responders were called. By the time help arrived, Tabit had already suffered fatal chest compression and head trauma after being crushed between the boat and the flume structure, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later determined the ride itself had been functioning normally. The primary factor was that Tabit had deliberately leaned outside the ride vehicle during the high-speed splashdown, placing his body into the narrow clearance space beside the flume channel. It was July 2, 2017. The concrete pathways at a regional water park in central Ohio were slick with chlorinated water and sunscreen residue. As afternoon temperatures pushed past 92 degrees, Kevin Mardo, a 19-year-old from a suburb outside Columbus, stood in the queue for the park's main log flume attraction. Kevin had a documented history of ignoring posted safety rules during outings. Former teachers and part-time supervisors had previously noted repeated incidents involving him entering restricted areas and trying to bypass normal ride procedures rather than waiting his turn. One relative later told investigators Kevin had joked earlier that afternoon that he didn't need to wait in lines and could find quicker ways onto rides. Log flume rides feature gravity-driven water channels moving 400-pound fiberglass boats at 8 to 12 miles per hour through narrow guide rails with minimal clearance. Automated conveyors return empty boats. Riders must board from supervised platforms only. The 8 to 10-inch gap between hull and channel is wide enough for water, but too narrow for human limbs or torsos, depending on orientation. A service gate near the unloading zone had been propped open by maintenance staff addressing a minor drainage issue under an active work order that had not yet cleared the area for public exposure. Two relatives later told investigators they called his name when they spotted him slipping through, with one stating he appeared to be trying to jump into a returning empty log instead of waiting at the loading platform. Neither physically pursued him or alerted staff immediately. The ride attendant stationed at dispatch was troubleshooting a boat that had stalled on the conveyor belt while operating alone at the control position. Kevin walked along the exit platform toward the return channel, where empty boats circled back toward the loading area. Surveillance footage from an overhead catwalk camera showed him crouching at the platform edge with his hands extended toward an approaching empty log, as if preparing to climb in mid-return. The platform's surface, constantly wet from splash and overflow, offered minimal traction. Park inspection records noted that non-slip coating in that section was due for resurfacing within 30 days, with a pending maintenance ticket logged but not yet scheduled. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Kevin attempted to jump into a passing empty log. His right foot slipped on the wet fiberglass edge. He fell backward into the water-filled trough, landing on his left side and rotating partially onto his back. The following log, weighing 400 pounds and traveling at 9 miles per hour, had already been dispatched into the return channel seconds earlier, after ride spacing tightened during the earlier conveyor delay. The current pushed Kevin sideways until his left shoulder and upper torso became pinned at an angle between the boat's bow and a protruding concrete guide flange. A maintenance worker on an overhead catwalk heard shouting and looked down to see Kevin's arms flailing above the waterline. He immediately radioed the control booth. The boat continued forward under water current and residual conveyor momentum. The emergency stop was triggered, but momentum carried the boat several feet further along the guide rail. Before deceleration fully halted movement, A second log that had already entered the zone advanced from behind, increasing pressure at the contact point. Kevin's movement stopped. Park rescue personnel, stationed at the first aid building 200 yards away, were notified at and reached the scene in approximately 5 minutes. Responders secured electrical lockout procedures and manually winched both boats backward, using ride rescue equipment to access Kevin. He showed no pulse and displayed massive crush injuries to his chest and abdomen when extracted. The county medical examiner determined death resulted from traumatic asphyxiation and internal hemorrhaging. The family filed wrongful death litigation against the park operator, citing inadequate gate security and delayed emergency response. The case settled for an undisclosed sum 18 months later.
It was August 12, 2017, at a large theme park in Sandusky, Ohio. The park was packed with families and tourists enjoying the summer weather. One of the most popular attractions was a roller coaster known for its speed, steep drops, and powerful turns. Travis Trevino was 24 years old and lived in Miami, Florida. He worked at a car rental company and spent his free time making videos for social media. He had built a loyal following that enjoyed his unusual challenges and adventures. Most of his videos got a few thousand views, but his followers liked that he always tried things other people would not bother attempting. Outside of work, he was constantly thinking up strange ideas that would make people laugh or leave them wondering why anyone would even try. His friends knew him as the person who always suggested something nobody else would. During the summer of 2017, Travis and several friends planned a weekend trip to Orlando and spent a day at the theme park. For weeks before the trip, they talked about which rides they wanted to try. Travis quickly became focused on one goal. He wanted to do something on a roller coaster that nobody had ever attempted before. His ideas started off harmless enough. He talked about solving a puzzle during the ride or trying to write his name while the coaster was moving. Then a few days before the trip, he settled on something different. He wanted to eat an entire 10-piece box of chicken nuggets while riding the coaster. The challenge made no sense, which was exactly why he liked it. He could not find a single person online who had tried it. His friends immediately told him it was a stupid idea. He told them that people rode roller coasters every day and that eating a full meal on one was something different entirely. And honestly, I understand the appeal of that logic. Nobody has done it. It sounds ridiculous. Those are usually the videos that pop off. I just do not think he thought through what a roller coaster actually does to your body while it is moving. On the morning of August 12th, the group arrived at the park and spent hours working through different attractions. The closer they got to the coaster, the more determined Travis became. Shortly before joining the line, he bought a 10-piece box of nuggets from a nearby restaurant and hid them under his jacket so ride operators would not spot them. His friends kept telling him not to do it. He ignored every one of them. Imagine being warned by everyone not to endanger your life. Well, it might not make sense to some, but what comes next changes everything. When they boarded the train, Travis sat next to a friend, and another friend agreed to record the attempt on a phone. As the train left the station, he pulled out the box and opened it. The first section of the ride went exactly as he expected. He laughed and held up the nuggets while the train climbed the first hill. The wind picked up and people around him were already screaming as the coaster built speed. Travis started eating. It was harder than he expected. The coaster was moving fast, and every turn threw his body in a different direction, making it difficult to hold the box and eat at the same time. He managed to keep going through the first drops and turns, but the forces pressing against his body with each change in direction made swallowing nearly impossible to control. On a steep section of the ride, the coaster accelerated hard, and Travis attempted to swallow a piece of food at the same moment the train hit a sharp turn. The sudden G-force pushed everything in his body in the wrong direction. The food lodged in his airway instead of going down. He had no way to cough it free. The speed of the ride, the noise around him, and the restraint holding him in the seat meant he could not move properly to help himself. His hands went to his throat, but there was nothing he could do from inside the moving train. His friends noticed he had gone quiet. The coaster was loud and the wind was strong, and everyone was being thrown around, so nobody picked up on it immediately. They called his name a few times during the final section of the ride, but could not tell if he was answering over the noise. It was only as the train pulled back into the unloading station that they realized something was wrong. Travis was slumped in his seat and not responding. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported Travis to a nearby hospital. Although doctors were able to remove the obstruction and continue treatment, Travis had suffered severe oxygen deprivation before help could reach him. He remained in critical condition but never regained consciousness and died the following day. The medical examiner determined that he died from asphyxiation caused by a food blockage in his airway. Investigators reviewed witness statements, ride records, and the phone video, concluding that eating during the high-speed ride contributed to the fatal choking incident. His friends were sitting right next to him, calling his name over the noise. They thought he was just quiet. I think about that final section of the ride and what those few seconds must have felt like for them when the train pulled back into the station. The video was never uploaded. Travis had wanted to attempt something unusual on a roller coaster. It was the last thing he ever did.
It was September 9th, 2016, and the New Mexico evening was settling in the way it does in early fall. The daytime heat had started to ease off, dropping into the low 80s as the sun moved toward the western horizon. Albuquerque was hosting one of its weekend festivals, the kind that pops up in open lots around the city with portable rides, food vendors, and string lights draped between metal poles. These aren't the big permanent parks with year-round maintenance crews. These are traveling setups, assembled in a few days, run for a weekend, and torn down by Monday morning. If you've ever been to one, you know the vibe. Diesel generators humming in the background, the smell of funnel cake and dust, kids running between attractions while parents try to keep up. I actually grew up going to traveling festivals just like that one, and Bryson's story made me sick thinking about how many live wires I probably walked past as a kid. Let me tell you about Bryson Dwin. Bryson was 34 years old and worked as a mechanic, the kind of guy who spent his weekdays elbow deep in engines and transmissions, fixing things for a living. From what I've gathered, he was practical, hands-on, the type who understood how machines worked because he dealt with them every single day. That weekend, he had come out to the festival on his own, just looking to unwind after a long work week. Bryson ended up on a spinning attraction, one of those rides that whips you around in circles while the individual cars rotate on their own axis. He climbed in, the ride started, and for a while everything was fine. Then it wasn't. The ride stopped mid-cycle. Not a gradual slowdown, but a sudden halt triggered by a power fault warning in the control system. The cars were still elevated, and riders were stuck in place while the operator tried to figure out what had happened. Maintenance was called over to check the control cabinet near the base of the ride. A service panel had been opened earlier, and the area around the base was exposed. Now here's the detail that changes everything about this story. The main disconnect had not been shut off. The ride was still fully energized. Every cable, every connection, every piece of metal attached to that system was still carrying current, and nobody told the riders. Staff began unloading people, telling them to step down onto the platform. Bryson climbed out of his car and moved toward the exit. He reached out and grabbed a metal railing attached to the ride frame to steady himself. At the same time, his foot came down on an exposed cable inside the open service panel. The cable was live. Witnesses standing nearby saw his body stiffen immediately. He couldn't let go. That's how electricity works. When current passes through your muscles, they contract. Your hand locks around whatever you're holding. He stayed locked in that position for several seconds before collapsing onto the platform. Burn marks were later found on the cable insulation where his foot had made contact. The current had traveled through his body from his foot to his hand, passing through his core. He was told to get off the ride. He was following instructions. He grabbed a railing that should have been safe to touch. He stepped where anyone would have stepped. The failure wasn't his. Power was finally shut off and staff pulled him clear. CPR was attempted until paramedics arrived. Bryson Dwin was pronounced dead right there on that platform. The investigation confirmed the main disconnect had never been turned off. The ride was still energized when staff began the evacuation. The open service panel left live cables exposed in an area where riders were being directed to walk. The local operator received multiple safety violations for leaving the ride energized during an evacuation. And what I keep coming back to with this one is that Bryson was a mechanic. He worked with machines every day. He understood voltage, current, the danger of live systems. But none of that mattered because he had no reason to suspect the ride was still powered. He trusted that the people running the operation had done the one thing you absolutely have to do before you put human beings near exposed electrical components. They hadn't. I actually grew up going to traveling festivals just like that one, and Bryson's story made me sick thinking about how many live wires I probably walked past as a kid. But the next case hit me differently, because this time there was no spark, no impact, no moment you could even point to. Just a woman sitting in the dark waiting for a ride to start again, not knowing the air around her was already killing her. It was October 19, 2014, in Fresno, California. The county fairgrounds were packed by early evening, the smell of fried food and diesel mixing in the summer heat as families moved between rides and vendor stalls along the midway. Melissa Carr, 29, had come to the exposition with two friends. She worked as a pharmacy technician at a clinic in the city and had spent most of the afternoon moving through the fairground attractions with the easy comfort of someone who had grown up going to summer fairs. By early evening, the group had worked their way toward the main attraction at the far end of the midway, a compact steel roller coaster that formed the centerpiece of the traveling exposition. The ride drew a long queue throughout the day. Melissa joined it without hesitation, and when I was researching this one, that detail stood out to me immediately. She had grown up going to fairs like this, which meant rides like this probably felt completely routine to her. The coaster was a portable steel wild mouse design, transported between fairgrounds throughout the season. Its trains consisted of 6 cars with 2 riders per row. Each seat used a ratcheting lap bar that locked into a toothed track when lowered. The ride relied entirely on attendants to manually check each restraint before dispatch. Now, that might sound unimportant, but I need you to hold on to that, because for this story, it becomes the entire point. 3 days earlier, operators had begun noticing that the lap bar on car 4 left seat was stopping slightly higher than usual during loading. When pushed down with additional pressure, the bar would produce a click and appear to lock. Because it seemed to engage after the extra push, the car was kept in service through the busy weekend crowds. And I want to be direct about that decision. They knew something was off. They kept it running anyway. What operators could not see was that the ratchet teeth inside the mechanism had worn and rounded through the season. Instead of locking fully behind a tooth, the pawl only partially engaged with the worn ratchet, allowing the bar to slip under load. From the outside, the restraint appeared normal. The click sounded correct, and the bar held during a tug test. That evening, Melissa took the left seat in car 4. The newly assigned attendant on platform duty had not been briefed on the issue with that restraint. He lowered the bar. It stopped slightly high. He pushed it down again. A faint click followed as the pawl partially engaged with the worn ratchet tooth. He pulled upward on the bar. It held. He moved on to the next car and signaled the control operator that the train was clear. From the attendant's perspective, nothing about that check would have looked unusual. The train left the station and entered the course. The lap bar held through the early turns before the train accelerated into a tight banked turn roughly 30 feet above the ground. As the car swept through the turn, lateral force combined with a brief reduction in downward pressure on the bar, conditions the worn mechanism could not withstand. The partially engaged pawl slipped free from the worn ratchet tooth. The bar swung upward. Melissa was ejected from the seat mid-turn and fell 30 feet into the gravel-covered restricted area beside the track. The train completed the remainder of the course and rolled back into the station with the left seat of car 4 empty. I think this is when they realized something had gone terribly wrong. The control operator halted the ride and called the ride supervisor. Emergency services were dispatched immediately. Paramedics and fire personnel reached the scene within minutes and found Melissa unresponsive in the gravel beside the track. She was transported by ambulance to a medical center where she was pronounced dead. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma sustained from the fall. The coaster was removed from operation while investigators conducted a full mechanical inspection of the restraint system. That bar looked normal. It sounded right, but the crazy part to me was that the teeth that were supposed to hold it in place had already worn down enough to slip. It was October 22, 2016, at a fall festival in rural Ohio. Crowds move through the midway between food stalls and carnival rides, including a haunted ghost train set up inside a converted warehouse where small ride carts carried guests through dark tunnels filled with fog, props, and sudden jump scares from hidden actors. Merritt Glunt, a 44-year-old logistics supervisor known among co-workers for his quick temper, had come to the festival that evening with a woman he had recently started dating. At work, he was used to solving problems with direct action, often responding to tense situations before taking time to think them through. That same impulsive reaction sometimes surfaced outside the workplace, especially when he felt embarrassed or caught off guard. Earlier that night, the pair had been walking through the festival grounds when they decided to try the haunted ghost train ride. At the entrance, staff reminded riders not to touch the actors, leave the ride vehicle, or open any marked staff doors. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Merritt and his date boarded a two-person cart as the ride carried them slowly through dark rooms, where actors appeared beside the track to startle passing riders. In one section, a masked performer burst from behind a panel, causing Merritt to flinch while his date laughed at the reaction. The moment clearly irritated him. Moments later, another actor stepped out beside their cart in a second jump scare. Still embarrassed, Merritt reacted instantly and swung his arm outward, striking the performer across the shoulder with enough force to push them backward. Following standard safety procedures for aggressive guests, the actor immediately retreated through a nearby staff door beside the track and attempted to close it behind them. Instead of remaining seated as the cart continued along the ride path, Merritt stood up and stepped out of the slowly moving cart. Ignoring the posted warnings, he forced the staff door open and stepped into the restricted backstage corridor after the performer. His date quickly followed him through the doorway, calling out for him to stop. She told him they could speak to the actor after the ride ended and warned him that the backstage area was dark and filled with fog from the attraction's special effects. But Merritt ignored her and continued moving deeper into the corridor. Behind the set walls, the narrow passage was lit only by dim maintenance lights, while artificial fog drifted through the space from nearby machines. Prop carts, cables, and storage racks lined the tight corridor used by staff to move between scenes. Focused on catching up with the performer and unwilling to slow down, Merritt hurried forward through the low visibility without letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. A tall steel storage rack stood along the wall ahead of him, partially obscured by the fog. Moving at full speed, Merritt failed to see the metal frame until it was too late. He collided with the structure and struck his head with severe force, collapsing immediately onto the concrete floor. His date, only a few steps behind him, witnessed the collision and began shouting for help. Ride operators quickly stopped the ghost train, and staff rushed into the corridor while emergency responders were called. Paramedics arrived shortly afterward, but pronounced Merritt dead at the scene from severe head trauma sustained during the impact. The ghost train ride was shut down for the remainder of the evening, while staff secured the backstage corridor. Merritt's date, who had followed him through the door moments earlier, remained with park staff as emergency responders arrived. The performer he had struck earlier was not seriously injured and returned to the staff area after the incident. Authorities later determined that Merritt had forced open a clearly marked staff-only door and entered the restricted backstage corridor where the fatal collision occurred. It was November 4th, 2013. The midday heat at a popular Mumbai amusement park pressed down on crowded pathways as thousands of visitors moved between attractions. Ravi Deshmukh, a 39-year-old food vendor, stood behind his fried snack stall. Ravi had operated seasonal food stalls for 6 years, moving between festivals, fairs, and amusement parks across Maharashtra. He specialized in fried street snacks, working 12-hour shifts during peak seasons to support his wife and 2 children in Pune. He had learned the trade from a cousin and picked up equipment maintenance through trial and error, never receiving formal training in gas system installation or safety protocols. The amusement park contracted him seasonally, valuing his low overhead costs and popular menu items. The park had previously allowed seasonal vendors to store spare cylinders under counters, despite local safety codes requiring certified connectors, leak detection, and annual inspections. Propane food vending demands proper pressure regulation, threaded connections, and leak detection. Being heavier than air, leaks pool in low areas. Concentrations of 2.1 to 9.5% are explosive near ignition sources, although odorized frying and crowd noise masked the smell. That morning brought unusually heavy crowds. By 12:30 in the afternoon, Ravi had already served over 200 orders when his primary propane tank ran empty during a surge of customers. Rather than closing temporarily, he immediately retrieved a replacement cylinder from storage. Working quickly in the cramped space beneath his serving counter, he threaded the connector onto the tank valve. Investigators later determined the fitting had resisted during installation, but Ravi continued tightening it, applying extra pressure. The connector had actually cross-threaded, not fully seated, leaking slowly into the enclosed lower compartment. He turned on the gas supply without performing a leak check, despite standard safety practices requiring one. Propane began escaping immediately into the enclosed lower compartment of his stall. The odor was faint, masked by cooking smells and poor ventilation. Within 8 minutes, explosive concentrations had built up in the confined space. At 12:47 in the afternoon, Ravi reached down to ignite his second fryer. The electric starter spark from the fryer element created a single spark. The accumulated propane ignited instantly in a violent deflagration. Witnesses described a bright orange flash, followed by a sharp cracking boom as the stall frame jolted upward under the pressure wave. The blast came from the propane air cloud. The cylinder was thrown by the pressure wave. The metal frame buckled outward as canvas walls disintegrated. Ravi was thrown backward 3 feet by the blast wave. His exposed skin blackened and clothing ignited. The explosion sent the propane tank tumbling into the crowd. Metal fragments and structural debris struck 2 guests standing 6 feet away. One suffered a severe leg laceration from flying sheet metal. The other sustained a fractured wrist and facial burns. Ravi collapsed beside the destroyed stall, his airways severely damaged by superheated gases. Nearby vendors immediately began shouting for help as smoke billowed upward. A vendor operating an adjacent beverage stand grabbed his radio and contacted park security. The park's fire suppression team arrived with extinguishers and medical supplies. City Fire Brigade units reached the scene moments later with advanced equipment and paramedics. Despite immediate treatment, Ravi died at the scene from catastrophic thermal injuries to his respiratory system and chest. The medical examiner determined he had inhaled flames directly, causing fatal damage to his lungs and airway. The amusement park implemented mandatory gas safety training and certification for all food vendors the following season. Local news coverage appeared briefly in a weekend safety feature but generated little public attention.
It was June 18th, 2018, at a crowded theme park in Anaheim, California. Thousands of visitors filled the park that day. Families waited in long lines, children ran between attractions, and employees moved through the crowds helping guests. Chandler James Remington was 22 years old and lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. He worked part-time at a sporting goods store and spent most of his free time roller skating and posting videos online. He had built a small, loyal following of around 4,000 people who enjoyed watching him skate in unusual places where people normally did not skate. Most of his videos got a few hundred views, and some reached a few thousand, but none had ever broken through to a wider audience. Chandler did not mind. He enjoyed making them and was always looking for a bigger idea that would finally get people talking. During spring 2018, he became focused on creating something that would stand out more than anything he had posted before. He visited the theme park with friends and noticed several decorative metal rails near one of the main walkways. The rails looked smooth, and he immediately started thinking about what he could do with them. Over the following 3 weeks, Chandler planned a video around one of those rails. The idea was to secretly bring roller skates into the park, jump onto the rail, and grind across its full length while his friends filmed from different angles. He practiced similar tricks at local skate parks throughout the weeks leading up to the trip, and by the time he arrived, he felt confident he could pull it off cleanly. To get the skates past security, he hid them in his backpack. Once inside the park, he went into a restroom and changed into them before meeting his friends near the target rail. I think about the effort that went into all of this, and what comes next is something that I find hard to sit with. From a distance, the rail had looked straight forward. Up close, it was a decorative handrail running beside one of the main walkways. It had not been built for skating. Underneath the rail were several metal support brackets spaced along its length, and at the far end, the rail curved toward a steel barrier protecting a maintenance access area. Chandler had noticed both details during his earlier visits and had believed the brackets would not interfere and that there would be enough space to exit the grind before reaching the curve. He had made that judgment while standing still looking at it from the side. He had not accounted for how fast everything would look once he was moving. Shortly after lunch, he spotted a brief gap in foot traffic and decided it was time. He pushed off and built speed before any nearby employees could register what was happening. He jumped and locked onto the rail. The first section went perfectly. He held his balance and moved smoothly across the metal surface. His friends cheered from the side while filming. Nearby guests stopped walking and turned to watch. Then he reached the final section. At skating speed, the curve arrived much faster than he had expected. The rail was shorter than it had looked from the walkway. He realized almost immediately that he had less room to exit than he had planned for and shifted his weight to jump clear of the rail before the curve. As he moved, the frame of one skate caught a metal support bracket underneath the rail. The contact stopped part of his momentum instantly and threw him forward out of the grind. He had no way to recover. He went headfirst into the steel maintenance barrier beside the pathway. The collision knocked him unconscious immediately, and his body dropped straight down onto the concrete below his head, hitting the surface a second time with the full weight of the fall behind it. He did not move after landing. Nearby guests ran toward him immediately while others called for help. His friends dropped their phones and rushed over. Park employees arrived quickly and called for emergency medical assistance. Paramedics reached the scene within minutes and began treatment at the scene before transporting Chandler to a nearby hospital. Doctors found multiple skull and facial fractures along with a severe traumatic brain injury caused by the impacts with both the steel barrier and the concrete. Emergency surgery was performed, but his condition continued to worsen. Chandler died on June 20, 2018, from complications of the brain injury. The medical examiner ruled his death a fatal traumatic brain injury caused by successive head impacts against a steel barrier and concrete. Investigators reviewed security footage, witness videos, and guest statements, concluding that Chandler lost control while attempting to exit the rail near its curved end after misjudging his speed and available space. He misjudged the speed. I keep coming back to that gap between what something looks like and what it actually is when you are moving through it. The video his friends recorded was never uploaded.
It was August 7, 2017, and the Missouri heat was doing what it does best in early August. Thick, oppressive, the kind of humidity that makes your clothes stick to your back before you've even walked across a parking lot. Branson sits in the Ozark Mountains, and while the elevation helps a little, summer afternoons there can still feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. The tourist district was packed that weekend, families and groups moving between the theaters, restaurants, and amusement attractions that keep the town running. Let me tell you about Stacy Trum. Stacy was 29 years old and worked at a shipping warehouse. From what I've learned, she was the kind of person who showed up for her coworkers. That weekend, she had come to Branson with a group from work after they'd finished a softball game. These weren't close friends necessarily, just people who worked together and decided to make a day of it. You know how those trips go. Someone suggests it, a few people say yes, and before you know it, you're standing in line for rides with people you mostly know from break room conversations. I keep thinking about how she didn't even have to be there. She just said yes to a last-minute invite, and somehow that one small choice ended up changing everything. The group had been walking around for a while when they decided to try the drop tower. This thing lifted riders up about 180 feet before releasing them into free fall. It's the kind of ride that looks terrifying from the ground, but once you're up there, you get maybe 3 seconds to think about what you've done before gravity takes over. The line had grown long, and I can tell you from experience that when lines get long at these places, operators start feeling pressure to move people through faster. Stacy climbed into her seat and lowered the lap restraint. Now here's where things went wrong, and this is important. The restraint didn't fully lock into its final position. It felt secure enough and appeared locked, but it hadn't fully engaged into its final locking position. And when the operator came around to check, he did what's called a visual inspection instead of the required pull check. He looked at each restraint, saw they appeared to be down and locked, and moved on. The ride had already completed several cycles that afternoon without incident. The tower began its slow climb upward. 180 feet doesn't sound like much until you're actually going up. The ground shrinks away, the other rides start looking like toys, and you get that familiar drop in your stomach as your brain starts calculating exactly how far you have to fall. At the top, there's always that pause, that moment where the mechanism holds you suspended, and everyone knows what's coming next. When the release triggered, the car dropped suddenly. This is exactly what's supposed to happen. The sudden acceleration forces riders upward against their restraints as the car falls away beneath them. But Stacy's restraint wasn't fully locked. The force pushed it upward, and it shifted instead of locking her in place. At the bottom, the car hit the pneumatic brakes and rebounded upward. This is also normal. What wasn't normal was that Stacy, no longer properly secured, slipped forward out of her seat during that rebound. She fell from the car and struck the metal platform near the base of the tower. The people waiting in line saw it happen. The impact caused severe head trauma and multiple fractures that were visible to anyone standing nearby. And here's what gets me about this one. The ride finished part of its programmed cycle before the operator even realized what had happened and stopped it. Emergency crews arrived and blocked off the loading area, but there was nothing they could do. Stacy Trum was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation confirmed exactly what you'd expect. The restraint had not been fully engaged, and the required pull check had been skipped during the safety inspection. The operator was removed from duty by park management, and the ride stayed closed while local officials reviewed training records. It was August 9, 2015 in Columbus, Ohio. The theme park on the north side of the city was packed by midday. The midway loud with music and rides running back to back under a sky that had turned white with heat by early afternoon. Lena Caldwell, 19, was studying nursing at a community college. She had come to the park that Saturday with her younger brother, spending most of the day on smaller rides before working their way toward the tallest structure on the midway. The drop tower rose more than 150 feet above the surrounding attractions, visible from almost every part of the park. Lena had been looking at it all day. And here's the first thing that stayed with me when I found this case. When they reached the queue, her brother hesitated, looked up at the top of the tower, and stepped out of line. Lena stayed. The operator waved her into a seat. She sat down quickly, and this detail matters, so remember it. She gripped the restraint bar with both hands before it was even lowered. The restraint came down against her thighs and clicked once, and from where she sat, it felt secure. Moments later, the gondola began its slow climb up the tower, the loading platform shrinking below as the ride rose higher above the park. From the top, the midway stretched out beneath the summer haze, the sounds of music and other rides drifting upward from the crowd below. This is where it begins to get interesting. The gondola slowed as it reached the top and paused briefly before the release triggered and the drop began. Riders screamed as the gondola plunged downward, the tower rushing past them in a blur of steel and cables. But seconds into the descent, something went wrong. Instead of slowing smoothly as it entered the braking section near the bottom, the gondola decelerated far more abruptly than riders expected. And from the research I did on drop towers, that braking phase is supposed to be the most controlled part of the entire ride. The sudden deceleration threw riders upward against their restraints, and Lena's restraint bar, which had not fully locked into place, failed to hold her in the seat. Witnesses later said they saw her lifted from the gondola as it slowed abruptly during the braking phase near the lower section of the tower. I just can't imagine how she felt at that very moment, but like every other incident like this, what happened next was inevitable. She fell from the gondola and struck the ground beneath the tower, and within seconds the screams spreading across the midway changed as people realized what had happened. Park security reached the area within seconds and immediately radioed for emergency services. Paramedics and fire personnel arrived minutes later and found Lena unresponsive at the base of the tower. Resuscitation was attempted at the scene, but Lena Caldwell was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Her younger brother was still standing near the ride's exit gate when paramedics reached her. Honestly, thinking of the fact that a brother won't go home with his sister is hard to sit with. Fire crews used the tower's service ladder and a maintenance platform to evacuate the remaining riders who were still suspended on the gondola. The ride was shut down immediately, while investigators examined the tower and reviewed maintenance records. During the investigation, officials determined the gondola had decelerated far more abruptly than intended during the braking phase near the bottom of the tower. Inspectors also found that Lena's restraint had not been fully secured before the ride began. Two separate failures, and the thing that gets me is that either one alone might not have killed her. It was both of them together. Following the investigation, the tower remained closed, and both the park operator and the maintenance contractor faced legal action over the incident. It was August 3rd, 2017, at a coastal amusement park in South Carolina. Towering steel roller coasters dominated the skyline as ride operators prepared for the evening rush. Valen Spade, a 24-year-old kitchen worker at a local seafood restaurant, had arrived with two co-workers before their evening shift. Known for her adventurous spirit and love of thrill rides, Valen had convinced them to squeeze in a few attractions before work. She had worked double shifts all week and was eager for the adrenaline rush that roller coasters could provide. The group approached a high-speed steel roller coaster, where riders sat in open cars, secured by individual ratcheting lap bars rather than shoulder harnesses. The restraints locked across the rider's thighs, with secondary seat belts serving as a backup. Valen chose the second row, left seat, settling into the molded seat as the operator moved down the line checking restraints. Witnesses later reported the restraints appeared properly secured when the train left the station. The operator pressed firmly on each lap bar and confirmed the seat belts before signaling the all clear. Investigators later noted that during the check, Valen had slightly lifted her hips and arched her back while laughing with her co-workers, a posture that can create extra space beneath the lap bar if the rider settles lower afterward. The train began its climb up the 112-foot lift hill, anti-rollback dogs clicking rhythmically against the track. At the top, riders could see the Atlantic Ocean before the train plunged downward at 56 miles per hour. After the first drop, the train sped through several high-speed turns before climbing a large camelback hill designed to create strong airtime, the sensation of weightlessness that briefly lifts riders from their seats. Several riders later reported seeing Valen lifting her arms and shifting inside the seat while laughing. Witnesses said she repeatedly tried to lift her hips and lean forward and sideways beneath the lap bar as the train climbed the hill. Investigators later determined the lap bar was resting higher than recommended on her thighs, leaving a larger than normal gap between the restraint and her body. Although the secondary seatbelt was fastened, it had enough slack to allow limited movement if a rider repeatedly lifted their hips. As the train crested the camelback hill, powerful negative G-forces briefly lifted riders upward. In Valen's case, the extra space beneath the restraint allowed her hips and torso to rise upward and partially sideways past the edge of the lap bar. As the train accelerated down the far side of the hill, she was ejected from the train. She fell roughly 45 feet, striking a steel support beam before landing on a concrete service path beneath the ride structure. Operators immediately shut down the coaster and cleared guests from the surrounding area. Emergency responders confirmed fatal injuries caused by severe head and spinal trauma from the fall. Inspectors later confirmed that the restraint system was functioning normally and had passed its safety checks. Investigators concluded the restraint had been positioned higher on her body at dispatch, and her repeated movements beneath the lap bar created enough space for her to slip free during the ride's strong airtime hill. The park issued a statement reminding visitors that restraints must remain fully secured and riders must stay seated at all times. Officials later described the incident as a tragic example of how ignoring basic ride safety rules can turn a thrill ride into a fatal mistake. It was August 9th, 2015. The air inside a family entertainment center in Bangkok, Thailand, hung thick with humidity and the sharp scent of recycled air conditioning. Niran Suti, a 28-year-old delivery route supervisor, had spent his Saturday afternoon at a nephew's birthday celebration, unaware that the children's play area would become the site of a preventable death. Niran worked for a regional beverage distribution company, managing delivery schedules across Bangkok's commercial districts. Co-workers described him as outgoing and physical, someone who took jokes too far when drinking. He had consumed 3 large beers with lunch at a nearby restaurant before arriving at the entertainment complex, a detail his sister would later confirm to investigators. His job required early mornings and long hours coordinating drivers, leaving weekends as his primary social outlet. Indoor play zones in Southeast Asia typically feature ball pits as centerpiece attractions. These are enclosed areas filled with lightweight plastic balls, designed for children to jump and play safely. Standard safety guidelines recommend pit depths between 24 and 36 inches, and in this installation the balls rested above a rigid plastic base with minimal cushioning beneath. The pits create an illusion of soft landing zones, but the shallow depth and firm foundation posed serious risks for adult body weight. That afternoon, Niran arrived at the party around 2:30 in the afternoon, visibly intoxicated according to multiple witnesses. The entertainment center's ball pit measured roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, filled with approximately 24 inches of multicolored plastic balls, resting directly on a hard plastic base. Warning signs posted in Thai and English prohibited adult entry, maximum capacity limits, and diving. Staff members were occupied with another birthday group in the arcade section, and no staff member had been assigned to actively supervise the play structure when Niran began joking loudly about jumping in. His sister told him to stop, but Niran was already climbing onto the perimeter ledge. Other parents watched but did not intervene, assuming he would step down. The ball pit appeared deceptively deep from surface level, the colorful balls concealing the shallow depth and hard base beneath. Without further warning, CCTV footage showed Niran launching himself headfirst from the elevated edge. The impact was immediate and devastating. His skull struck the rigid plastic base through the thin layer of balls. His body weight, approximately 180 pounds, drove him down with full force. He did not surface or move after entry. His torso sank face down into the balls, chest compressed against the unyielding foundation. The position prevented his ribcage from expanding, limiting his ability to breathe normally. Children continued playing around and on top of him, unaware a man lay dying beneath them for approximately 15 minutes. The balls shifted back into place after the dive, concealing his body beneath the surface. His dark clothing blended with the dim lighting inside the pit. The party area was separated from the play zone by a glass wall and filled with loud music from an adjacent celebration, further delaying recognition that something was wrong. At 3:02 in the afternoon, a group of children digging toward the bottom reached Niran's face. One 7-year-old noticed his open eyes were not blinking and alerted her mother. The parent immediately notified staff, who cleared the pit before 2 employees coordinated his removal within 3 minutes. Staff trained in CPR initiated resuscitation, while emergency services were contacted. No automated external defibrillator was available anywhere in the facility. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later, transporting Niran to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead with autopsy findings, indicating primary blunt force cranial trauma with secondary positional asphyxiation. The entertainment center permanently banned adult entry to all children's play equipment following the incident. Local authorities later cited the facility for inadequate supervision of the play area during peak occupancy hours.
It was the afternoon of September 19, 2015, at a county fair in Orlando, Florida. The fairgrounds were packed with families, teenagers, and tourists enjoying the weekend. Caspian Moore Dunmore was 21 years old and lived in Orlando. He worked part-time at a sporting goods store and spent much of his free time with friends and posting videos online. He had around 2,300 followers and enjoyed making content showing him trying different activities and challenges at local events. Outside of social media, Caspian was active and athletic. He had played sports growing up and liked testing himself physically. Friends described him as someone who was always willing to try something new and who got more interested in doing something the moment he saw someone else do it first. Earlier that afternoon, Caspian was standing near the Tagada, watching a skilled stunt rider inside the attraction perform a backflip while the ride was in full motion. The crowd reacted immediately. People cheered, pulled out phones, and pointed. The stunt rider looked experienced and landed cleanly without any problems. Caspian watched every detail from outside the barrier. The stunt stayed in his head. He brought it up several times while walking around the fair with his group, and the more he talked about it, the more convinced he became that he could do it too, but they laughed at him. He was young, fit, and confident in his body. The move looked difficult, but not impossible to him. Later that afternoon, Caspian bought a ticket and boarded the Tagada. He did not attempt anything during that first ride. Instead, he sat and paid close attention to how the platform moved beneath everyone. He watched how the bouncing worked, how the direction changed, and how the timing seemed to repeat. By the time the ride stopped, he felt he understood it well enough. He immediately got back in line. He used one ride as a study session, and that was the entire preparation. I genuinely do not know what else to say about that. His friend Nash asked if he was being serious. Caspian said he just wanted to try one thing. When they reached the front, he handed his phone to Nash and asked him to record. Nash assumed it would either work or end in a harmless tumble. Neither of them expected anything worse than that, and I think about Nash in that moment. He handed over the phone and said sure and wasn't prepared for what came next. The ride started. For the first few moments, Caspian stayed seated and watched the platform move beneath the other riders. Then he stood up and moved carefully toward the center of the disc. Nash kept the camera up from behind the safety barrier outside. Caspian waited for what he believed was the right moment to go. He had watched the ride once already. He thought he had figured out the timing. The platform bounced beneath him as he set himself up. The movement was slightly different from what he expected and disrupted his footing before he could adjust. Instead of sitting back down and waiting for a better moment, he decided to go anyway. He launched into the backflip with his balance already off. The takeoff was wrong from the start. As he left the surface, the ride moved again and changed his rotation in the air. He was no longer lined up to land on his feet. He came down at the wrong angle and hit the moving platform hard with the side of his head and shoulder. The impact whipped his neck sideways and his head bounced off the surface a second time before he could go limp. At first, some people watching assumed he had just taken a bad fall. Falls happened on the Tagada all the time, and riders usually laughed it off and sat back down. The operator kept the ride going for a brief moment before it became obvious something was seriously wrong. The ride was stopped. Staff moved into the attraction area and people nearby pressed against the barrier. Nash lowered his phone and ran toward the exit gate. Emergency crews responded immediately and transported Caspian to a nearby hospital. Doctors diagnosed a severe traumatic brain injury, but despite treatment, his condition worsened. Caspian died later that night. The medical examiner ruled his death a fatal traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force head impact during a failed acrobatic attempt on a moving fairground attraction. Investigators reviewed witness statements, ride records, and phone footage, concluding that Caspian had attempted a backflip on the moving platform after watching a trained stunt performer perform the same move earlier that day. Nash recorded the whole thing. He was standing outside that barrier holding the phone his friend handed him. I don't know how someone can live with that. The video was never posted online.
It was June 18th, 2016, and the summer heat had settled over northern Ohio the way it always does in mid-June. Thick, humid, the kind of air that sticks to your skin the second you step outside. Sandusky sat along the Lake Erie shoreline, and on weekends like this one, the local amusement parks pulled in crowds from all over the region. Families, couples, groups of friends, all looking for a few hours of noise and adrenaline before the sun went down. Now let me tell you about Diane Phipps. Diane was 41 years old, worked in a dental office, and from everything I've gathered, she was the kind of person who showed up for her family. That weekend, she had made the trip out to Sandusky with her brother and his 2 kids. This wasn't some big vacation. It was just a summer day trip, the kind where you pack the car, grab some snacks, and try to make a good memory with the people you care about. And honestly, I think that's what makes this one hit harder. She wasn't even on a ride. The group had been walking through the park for most of the afternoon, hitting different attractions, grabbing food, doing the usual. At some point, they ended up near the exit path of one of the high-speed spinning rides. There was a waist-high metal fence separating the spectator area from the ride zone, and people were standing around watching. Diane stopped about 12 feet from the fence and pulled out her phone to film the ride as it spun at full speed. Her brother and the kids were nearby. Nothing about this moment felt dangerous. She was just standing there, recording. Now here's what she didn't know, and what honestly nobody in that crowd knew. Earlier that same day, operators had paused the ride after noticing unusual vibration coming from one of the outer cars. A maintenance worker was brought in and tightened several bolts on a side access panel. During the check, the inspection noted stripped threads on 2 of the fasteners. A temporary fix was applied, but the panel wasn't fully secured, and the supervisor cleared the ride for continued operation. The ride ran several more full-speed cycles after that. each one putting stress on a panel that was no longer properly secured. So Diane is standing there, phone up, watching the ride spin. And as it hits maximum rotation, the centrifugal force starts doing exactly what physics says it will. That loose panel begins shaking violently. The two remaining bolts can't take it. They tear free, and a rectangular steel panel rips clean off the car. And I'll be straight with you, this is the part that gets me. A maintenance worker actually handled those stripped bolts, saw they weren't right, and the ride still went back into operation with people on it. I really can't make that make sense in my head. It clears the fence, flies into the spectator area, and strikes Diane on the right side of her head. The impact knocked her backward onto the concrete. Her skull fractured from the panel, and the back of her head hit the pavement hard as she fell. Blood began pooling beneath her almost immediately, and the ride, it kept spinning. For several seconds, nobody in the control booth knew what had happened. It wasn't until people in the crowd started screaming that the operator hit the emergency stop. I want you to sit with that for a second. She was 12 feet behind a fence. She wasn't on the ride. She was filming it. Park staff reached her within minutes and started CPR when she stopped breathing. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Diane Phipps was pronounced dead. The investigation that followed confirmed what should have been obvious before the ride ever restarted. The access panel was missing fasteners that should have been replaced before the attraction went back into service. Inspection notes showed the stripped bolts had been documented, but the ride was not locked out after a supervisor approved continued operation. The operator on duty was removed from ride assignment after inspection logs were reviewed, and the ride stayed shut down for the rest of the season. It was July 12, 2014, in Orlando, Florida. The theme park was at full capacity by late morning. Families moving through the heat between attractions, while the smell of sunscreen and wet concrete drifted across the midway. Michael Donnelly, 41, worked as a high school history teacher. He had driven up that morning with his two children, Emma, 8, and Ryan, 10, for a day out during the summer break. Michael was the kind of father who spent his holidays driving his kids to places they would remember. And when I came across that detail during my research, I had to sit with it for a second, because that is exactly the kind of person this should never have happened to. By early afternoon, they had worked through most of the park and joined the queue for the log flume near the back of the grounds. The flume was one of the oldest rides in the park. Riders sat in a narrow fiberglass log that drifted slowly through artificial rapids before climbing a lift hill and dropping down a steep final descent into a wide splash pool at the base. The impact of the drop was moderated by the depth of the water in the pool. At the correct operating depth, the deceleration was sharp but manageable. A shared grab bar ran across the front of the log, and riders were instructed over the speaker to hold it during the descent. And this is where it starts to get interesting. That morning, the splash pool had been partially drained overnight for cleaning. Maintenance crews began refilling it before the park opened, but did not complete the process before the ride was cleared for operation. The water level at the base of the drop remained well below its designed operating depth. From the loading platform, the difference was not obvious. The ride opened on schedule. Trust me when I say this. From where guests were standing, nothing about the ride looked unusual. Michael and his children chose the front log. Emma sat between Michael and Ryan. The operator checked the grab bar and the log moved out into the channel. The upper section of the ride wound slowly through artificial boulders and shallow rapids. The water was calm and cool in the afternoon heat. Ryan laughed at something ahead. Emma gripped the bar with both hands and watched the water slide past the sides of the log. Everything about this looked like a normal afternoon. And that is exactly what makes what comes next so hard to sit with. At the top of the lift hill, the log paused at the crest before tipping forward. From that position, the splash pool and unload dock were visible far below. Emma leaned forward slightly and Michael felt her shift beside him. He took one hand off the safety bar and reached toward her shoulder to steady her. She settled back into the seat. He did not return his hand to the bar. The log tipped over the edge. The descent lasted only seconds. At the base of the drop, where the log was designed to enter water deep enough to slow it gradually, the boat struck the surface harder than expected. With the splash pool well below its required operating depth, every rider felt the impact. But Michael had nothing to brace against. The force of the stop drove upward through the seat and into his lower spine. It's one of those tiny moments that probably didn't seem important at the time. The log drifted across the pool and bumped against the unload dock. The operator asked riders to step out. Ryan climbed out first. Emma followed. Michael remained seated. He was upright but unable to stand. When operators asked if he could move, he told them he could not feel his legs. And this is the point where I want to pause. Two kids standing there watching their father tell someone he could not feel his legs. I don't have words for that. Ride staff stopped operations and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Michael conscious, but unable to move from the seat. He was carefully immobilized and transported by ambulance to the hospital. Imaging later confirmed severe spinal cord damage sustained at the moment of impact. Michael Donnelly never walked again. 11 days later, he died in the hospital from complications related to his injuries. Investigators later determined that the splash pool had not been refilled to its correct operating depth before the ride opened that morning. For Michael Donnelly, the moment that changed everything lasted less than 2 seconds. I honestly can't imagine what that moment must have felt like. It was July 14th, 2016, at an amusement park in Missouri. Families moved between attractions as the park's vintage narrow-gauge railway carried visitors through wooded sections of the grounds. Hanson Bricks, a 31-year-old warehouse worker, had driven over from his shift at a regional storage facility about 10 miles away. His sister later told investigators that Hanson rarely went to amusement parks and almost declined the trip, but he agreed after his niece insisted he come along. He wore a stainless steel bracelet that had belonged to their father, who had died several years earlier. The band had loosened over time, and throughout the day, Hanson kept adjusting it while waiting in ride lines, joking that losing it would feel like losing the last thing his dad had given him. The family spent most of the afternoon exploring the park's attractions, with Hanson accompanying his nephew and niece from ride to ride. Around 5:10 in the afternoon, their group stepped off the narrow-gauge sightseeing train after completing the scenic loop through the wooded sections of the park. The locomotive and 2 passenger cars had just pulled into the station when Hanson suddenly felt the bracelet slip from his wrist. He watched it fall onto the ballast gravel between the rails about 6 feet from the platform edge. A nearby sign clearly warned guests not to enter the track area, and a ride attendant was preparing the train for its next departure. Instead of asking staff to retrieve it, Hanson waved off his sister and said he would grab it real quick. Without alerting staff, Hanson stepped down from the platform and walked about 18 feet along the track bed toward the bracelet. Witnesses later said the attendant shouted for him to get off the tracks, but Hanson continued anyway. The next train had already been dispatched around the loop and was approaching the station. The locomotive and passenger cars moved at roughly 8 miles per hour along the straight section leading to the platform. Hanson crouched between the rails, facing away from the incoming train while searching through the loose gravel. As the train cleared the trees, the engineer noticed movement on the track and immediately sounded the horn from roughly 120 feet away. Hanson remained focused on the ground and did not react. He stood up with the bracelet in his hand and turned to step away. His right foot slipped into a shallow depression in the ballast beside the rail. When he tried to pull back, the heel caught against the rail base while the front of his shoe wedged between the rail and the wooden tie beneath it. Witnesses saw him tug upward repeatedly, struggling to free his foot as people on the platform shouted for him to move. The locomotive reached him moments later. The front pilot plate struck his pelvis, knocking him backward onto the rails before the leading wheel assembly rolled across his lower body. The train stopped about 20 feet past the impact point. Park staff used a mechanical jack stored near the station to lift the locomotive enough to remove him from beneath the axle. Emergency responders confirmed fatal injuries caused by severe pelvic crushing and blood loss. The bracelet was still clenched in his hand. Investigators later determined Hanson had deliberately entered the restricted track area despite posted warning signs and staff instructions. The train ride remained closed for the rest of the day while the track area was inspected. Officials later noted that park staff routinely retrieved dropped items from the tracks for guests, something that would have taken less than a minute if Hanson had simply asked for help. It was May 18, 2016. A large Ferris wheel with sealed glass capsules carried passengers nearly 400 feet above a riverside amusement district in northern China. Lian Xiao, a 24-year-old junior accountant, was in capsule number 7 with 2 co-workers. Lian worked in accounts receivable at a mid-sized freight company, processing invoices and tracking shipments. Co-workers described her as meticulous with spreadsheets but frequently ignoring surroundings while focused on getting the perfect shot on her phone. Over the past 3 months, she had become increasingly focused on documenting every weekend trip, restaurant visit, and scenic location with carefully composed photographs. The new phone represented 2 months of savings, and colleagues said that she treated it like professional equipment, often spending 20 minutes perfecting a single shot. This particular Ferris wheel's capsules have cushioned benches along the perimeter and a low central column with a small luggage shelf. Each capsule holds 8 passengers. The curved glass panels are secured by steel frames with upper and lower retaining clips, designed to withstand wind loads and passenger movement during the 30-minute rotation cycle. That afternoon, Leon grew frustrated trying to capture both herself and the skyline through the pod's curved glass, and began searching for higher angles inside the capsule. The bench seating blocked optimal angles, and reflections ruined multiple attempts. Her co-workers sat on the benches, watching the view and occasionally glancing at Leon as she moved around the confined space. Another passenger, a businessman from Shanghai, later told investigators he watched Leon examine the central column and adjacent trim pieces, testing the edge of the bench and surrounding panel. As the capsule approached peak height at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Leon climbed onto the perimeter bench near the central column, a position clearly marked for seated use. Despite the businessman verbally warning her to sit down, she ignored him, standing unsteadily while holding her phone at arm's length. Needing more distance for a wider shot, she leaned her full weight backward against the glass wall, pressing her shoulders and upper back firmly against the panel while extending her arms forward. The glass panel had been installed during original construction 8 years earlier. Investigators later found the upper clip, a painted carbon steel fitting exposed to river spray and urban pollution, had extensive crevice corrosion and micro cracks that routine visual inspections had failed to detect. The panel's lower edge remained secured, but the top had developed microscopic movement. When Leon shifted her full 118 pounds against the upper portion, lateral pressure overwhelmed the weakened clip. Both co-workers and the businessman reported hearing a sharp cracking sound. The top edge of the glass panel separated from its frame and tilted outward, creating a widening gap. Leon's backward momentum carried her through the opening before she could react. Her body fell approximately 394 feet in roughly 5 seconds. The impact occurred at 2:17 in the afternoon. A tower camera focused on the wheel's rim showed the panel shift, and the operator monitoring that feed immediately initiated emergency stop protocols, halting the wheel's rotation within 40 seconds. The park's medical team reached the base structure in 6 minutes, but found Leon unresponsive with obvious fatal trauma. Municipal emergency services arrived in 14 minutes and officially pronounced death at the scene. The medical examiner's report documented massive blunt force trauma causing instant death from multiple catastrophic injuries. The observation wheel remained closed for 2 weeks while provincial safety inspectors examined all capsules, performed ultrasonic testing on all upper clips, and discovered corrosion in 11 other upper clips across different pods. The operating company faced lawsuits filed by Leon's family claiming negligent maintenance and inadequate safety inspections, and later settled out of court for undisclosed amounts.
It was the afternoon of May 22, 2019, at a large theme park in Orlando, Florida. Long lines stretched outside popular attractions. Employees moved through the crowds, helping guests, and music played throughout the themed areas. Gertrude Adira was 31 years old and lived in Jacksonville, Florida. She worked as a chef at a local restaurant and made videos in her spare time focused on food, travel, and places she visited on her days off. Over time, she had built a loyal following of around 6,900 people. She was not widely famous, but her followers liked her personality and interacted with her posts regularly. A few months before the trip, she noticed that videos filmed from unusual locations got more attention than her normal uploads. She began looking for places that looked dramatic on camera, even when the actual situation was far less exciting than it appeared. Around that time, Gertrude decided she wanted to create a fantasy-themed video unlike anything she had posted before. After watching costume creators online, she built a large set of decorative wings from lightweight craft materials. The wings were made for appearance only, attached to a harness worn across her shoulders, and looked impressive in photos and videos. While testing them at home, she jumped from short walls and benches a few feet off the ground while wearing them. She always landed fine. Because nothing bad ever happened, she slowly started convincing herself that the wings made her jumps feel slightly safer and slowed her descent a little, even though they were decorative props with no ability to carry weight or create any lift at all. And that progression is something I find genuinely unsettling. Every safe landing from a few feet up became evidence to her that the wings were doing something until what happened next. On May 22nd, Gertrude visited the theme park with her younger sister. They planned to spend the day filming content and enjoying the attractions. During the afternoon, Gertrude noticed a decorative rock formation inside one of the themed sections of the park. The structure looked natural, but had been built as scenery and was not designed for climbing. Parts of the area had barriers and signs telling guests to stay out. From where she stood, Gertrude decided the formation was the perfect background for the video she had been planning. The higher position would make the wings stand out against the sky and create the impression she was about to glide. She climbed up anyway. Her sister stayed below with a camera while Gertrude made her way up through the decorative structure. Several guests nearby noticed what she was doing. A park employee spotted her and began moving toward the area. Gertrude jumped before anyone could reach her. The plan was to spread the wings as she dropped and create footage that would look impressive on camera. She had jumped in the wings before from a few feet up and walked away fine every time. She believed the same thing would happen now. It did not. There's something that still baffles me. What exactly was going on in her mind when she took that jump? The moment she left the rock formation, it became clear the wings were doing nothing. There was no slowing down and she was not gliding. She fell roughly 20 feet before hitting the ground. The impact drove her left side and shoulder into the concrete path below the formation. She did not move after that. Her sister dropped the camera and ran toward her immediately. Guests nearby rushed over and called for help. Her sister was standing right there, holding the camera. She filmed the whole thing. I don't know how you process being the person holding that footage. Park employees secured the area and directed first responders to the scene. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began treating Gertrude before transporting her to a nearby hospital. Doctors found severe blunt force traumatic injuries from the fall. Despite emergency treatment and continued efforts by medical staff, her condition could not be stabilized. Gertrude Adira died later that day. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as fatal blunt force traumatic injuries, consistent with a fall from a height of approximately 20 feet onto a hard surface. Investigators reviewed witness statements, security footage, and the video recorded by her sister. They found no structural failure or park malfunction. What began as a Leandro for views ended in the most horrible way.
It was July 23, 2015, and central Pennsylvania was experiencing one of those perfect summer afternoons that makes you forget how brutal the humidity can get. The temperature sat in the low 80s, with just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. Hershey had that sweet smell in the air that comes from the chocolate factory, mixed with the sounds of families enjoying their summer vacations. The amusement park was busy but not packed. The kind of crowd where you could still walk around without constantly bumping into people. Let me tell you about Coulter Napa. Coulter was 36 years old and worked in delivery, spending most of his days driving routes around his home state. He was visiting Pennsylvania that week with his 2 nephews, and from everything I've gathered, he was the kind of uncle who actually showed up. This wasn't a quick visit where you say hello and leave. He had planned activities and was genuinely invested in giving them a memorable trip. That afternoon, they decided to try the log flume ride. The line was short, which was unusual for a summer day, but sometimes you get lucky. The ride itself was straightforward. artificial logs that seated 3 or 4 people, floating through a water channel with a few small drops and turns before ending at the unloading area. Nothing extreme, nothing that would make you think twice about safety. Now here's what Coulter didn't know. Earlier that day, the ride had been stopped after debris clogged the water intake. Maintenance crews cleared the blockage and restarted the main pump system. But when you restart a pump after it's been shut down, especially one that moves this much water, there's a period where the flow hasn't fully stabilized, creating uneven currents through the channel. The water in the return channel was moving unevenly, with sections pushing harder than normal. Coulter climbed into the back seat of the log with both nephews sitting in front of him. The log began its slow journey through the channel, following the guide rails that keep everything moving in the right direction. For most of the ride, everything felt normal. The kids were laughing, water was splashing, and they were having the kind of simple fun that makes these trips worth it. As they entered the final turn near the unloading area, that uneven current started doing what physics says it will. The water pushed against the front of the log, forcing it sideways in the narrow channel. The log struck the guide rail and turned crossways, blocking the normal flow of water. And when you block water that's already pushing unevenly through the channel, pressure builds up behind it. The back end of the log lifted as the current pushed against it. The log rolled onto its side, and all 3 of them went into the water. Both children fell clear into the shallow water and were able to get their footing. Coulter became trapped underneath the overturned log. The log wedged itself between the guide rail and the channel wall, pinning his torso underwater. The current that had caused the rollover was now holding the log in position, and water continued flowing over him. The kids were safe, but they were watching their uncle trapped just a few feet away. Staff reached the channel quickly, but they couldn't lift the log without tools. It was too heavy. The current was too strong, and it was wedged too tightly. They needed to shut down the pump and drain part of the channel before they could move it. The pump was shut off, and the water level began dropping, but it took several minutes. When they finally pulled the log away and got Coulter out, CPR was attempted immediately. He was transported to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Coulter Napa was pronounced dead. The investigation revealed the ride had been restarted before the water flow had stabilized after maintenance. The unstable water flow created conditions the ride wasn't designed to handle, and a routine turn became a fatal trap. What gets me about this case is that someone made the decision to reopen the ride too quickly. The local operator was cited for restarting the attraction before the water flow returned to normal parameters. This story makes me question every ride I've ever stepped on, because if a simple pump restart can kill someone at one of the most well-known parks in the country, I have to wonder what corners are being cut at places with far less oversight. Coulter was just trying to give his nephews a good day. Instead, they watched him die. It was June 28, 2014, in Charlotte, North Carolina. The regional park was running at full capacity, the queues backed up across the midway, and the afternoon heat sitting heavy over the grounds. Ethan Wallace, 27, had come to the park with 4 friends to mark the end of a long work week. He worked as a sales representative for a construction supply company and had spent most of the day moving through the park with his group. By mid-afternoon, they had worked their way to the family coaster near the center of the grounds and joined the queue without bothering to check the height restrictions posted at the entrance. The ride was designed for families with younger children. The trains were small and low to the track, open on the sides, with individual lap bars. The course ran through a series of gentle turns and small hills before passing through a narrow decorative tunnel built into an artificial rock structure at the midway point of the layout. According to the ride's design specifications, the clearance between the top of the train and the tunnel ceiling was about 14 inches. That measurement had been calculated carefully when the ride was built. It assumed riders would remain in their seats. Now I want you to hold on to that number for a second, 14 inches, because that clearance only works if everyone stays seated. Ethan and his group loaded into the front rows. The lap bars came down. The train left the station. The first section of the course was fast enough to feel exciting but controlled enough that Ethan's group was still talking and laughing. As the train moved through the opening turns, one of his friends in the row directly behind him was louder than the rest, joking through the entire first section. This is where things start to shift. As the train approached the rock structure and the tunnel opening came into view ahead, the friend shouted at Ethan to stand up when the train went through. Ethan turned back and laughed, and I'll be honest, when I read that part, my stomach kind of dropped because by that point, you already know where this is going. From where he was sitting, the tunnel entrance looked wide. The rock walls curved over the track and the opening appeared to have room above it. He pushed himself up from the seat just as the train entered the tunnel. Then the ceiling met the top of his skull at full speed. The force drove his head and neck downward into the seat with everything the train had behind it. The impact was immediate. The train emerged from the tunnel and continued along the final turn toward the station. Ethan was in his seat. He was not moving. His head was down and his body was slack against the lap bar. His friends in the rows behind him had gone completely silent. And this is the moment that really shocked me. The ride just kept moving like nothing had happened. The train rolled into the brake run and came to a stop at the station. Operators stepped forward and asked riders to exit. Nobody in the front row moved. The operator closest to the front car reached the train and immediately called for emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Ethan unresponsive in the front seat. Resuscitation was attempted at the scene, but Ethan Wallace was pronounced dead at the park. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury sustained from blunt force impact inside the tunnel structure. The ride was shut down immediately while investigators reviewed the incident and interviewed riders who had been on the train, including Ethan's friends seated behind him. According to park officials, warning signs posted at the entrance instructed riders to remain seated at all times. After the investigation concluded, the ride was allowed to reopen, but additional warnings were added near the loading platform reminding guests to stay seated throughout the ride. It was October 15th, 2017, at a fall festival in rural Indiana. The evening midway buzzed with flashing lights, music, and the mechanical hum of carnival rides spinning above the crowd. Near the center of the grounds stood a large rotor ride, a circular chamber designed to spin riders against its padded walls using centrifugal force. John Stevenson was a 19-year-old high school basketball captain, known among his friends for his confidence and competitive streak. On the court, he thrived on challenges, often pushing himself harder whenever someone doubted what he could do. That same attitude carried into everyday situations, especially when he was surrounded by friends who expected him to live up to that fearless reputation. Earlier that evening, John and 3 teammates were heading home from basketball practice when they noticed the festival lights along the roadside and decided to stop for a while. After walking the midway and sharing a few beers, their attention turned to a large rotor ride where riders stood against the wall of a spinning chamber, held in place by centrifugal force. Watching a cycle finish, one of John's friends joked that it looked easy and suggested a small bet. Anyone who could move away from the wall and reach the center while it was spinning would win the money. John immediately laughed and claimed he could do it without much trouble. To him, the ride seemed more like a simple balance challenge than anything dangerous. The group agreed on the bet, and a few minutes later they stepped inside the chamber with the next group of riders. When the ride began, the chamber slowly started to rotate. At first, the movement felt gentle as riders leaned back against the wall, but as the motor accelerated and the ride reached full speed, the floor beneath the riders dropped away, leaving everyone pinned tightly against the padded wall by the spinning force. John grinned as he felt the force holding him in place. Around him, riders lifted their feet slightly, allowing the force of the spinning chamber to keep them pinned against the wall. The bet was still fresh in his mind, and his friends were already shouting across the chamber, reminding him about the challenge. Instead of staying still like the others, John pressed his shoes firmly against the wall and began pushing his body forward, trying to move toward the center of the chamber. At first, he managed to shift slightly, leaning away from the wall while the ride continued spinning at full speed. The moment he pushed far enough away from the wall, he lost the surface that had been holding him in place. Without that stabilizing pressure, his balance collapsed instantly. His feet slipped as he lost his grip against the wall, and the spinning motion flung his body sideways across the rotating chamber. Before he could recover, the force hurled him violently back toward the outer wall. His head struck the rigid structure with severe force as the ride continued spinning for several seconds before operators realized something was wrong. Other riders began shouting and signaling for help as the chamber finally slowed to a stop. Emergency responders were called immediately, but John was pronounced dead at the scene from severe head trauma after striking the outer wall of the spinning chamber. The rotor ride was temporarily shut down while operators assisted investigators and inspected the equipment. Authorities later confirmed the ride had been functioning normally and that the fatal injuries occurred after John attempted to move away from the wall of the spinning chamber during a bet with friends. It was March 11th, 2014. The afternoon heat hung heavy over an amusement park in Jakarta, Indonesia, where the Ferris wheel turned slowly against a hazy sky. Arman Hadi, a 26-year-old retail inventory clerk, stood in line with his girlfriend Siska Wulan, waiting to board a gondola car that would lift them 80 feet above the crowded park. Arman worked at a department store distribution center, managing stock counts and warehouse logistics. Friends described him as easygoing but occasionally careless. Arman had been warned on previous rides, testing the rules but ignored the cautions. A Ferris wheel operates through a continuous rotation system where enclosed gondola cars hang from a central wheel structure via mounting brackets, with each car secured by primary and secondary door latches designed to withstand the stresses of motion and passenger weight. At significant heights, the gondola doors opened outward, placing additional stress on the latch whenever riders leaned or pushed against the panel. Arman had ridden this Ferris wheel 3 times before, and was familiar with how the gondolas swayed during the rotation cycle, especially near the top. That afternoon, he joked about the rocking motion, climbing onto the seat and deliberately leaning his full body weight against the outward opening door to make the car swing more dramatically. Siska asked him to stop multiple times, but Arman laughed it off, pressing his back firmly against the door panel. The park's maintenance records would later reveal the gondola's primary latch had suffered significant wear, consistent with heavy daily operation over 8 months, reducing its holding strength. A visual inspection missed the fatigue, and corrosion pitting was noted later during fracture analysis. 3 weeks earlier, during routine servicing, a maintenance worker had incorrectly reinstalled the secondary safety latch, leaving it misaligned by 6 millimeters. The misalignment had been recorded in the inspection log with a cursory signature, unnoticed by the supervisor. Neither issue had been flagged during inspections. As their car reached approximately 80 feet, the highest point of the rotation, Arman leaned back against the door again. He shifted his weight aggressively, trying to increase the rocking motion. The worn primary latch, already stressed by the swaying movement, began to separate from its housing. The improperly installed secondary latch offered no backup support. At 3:47 in the afternoon, the door released completely. Arman, still pressing his full weight against it, fell backward through the opening. He dropped 80 feet in roughly 2.2 seconds, accelerating rapidly during the fall before striking the ground. The impact killed him instantly. Siska, standing near the door, reflexively lunged forward as he fell. She partially tumbled through the opening, but managed to grab the gondola's floor edge with both hands. Her legs dangled in open air as she screamed continuously. Passengers in adjacent cars witnessed everything and began shouting for help. The ride operator, hearing the screams from a distant control booth, hit the emergency stop within 8 seconds, then engaged the manual override to slowly rotate the wheel so Siska could safely reach the ground. Park rescue personnel reached Siska 6 minutes later, followed by municipal paramedics 4 minutes later. Arman's body lay motionless on the concrete below, his skull fractured and chest cavity crushed from the high-impact collision with the steel frame. The medical examiner confirmed the injuries were instantly fatal due to massive internal trauma and catastrophic brain injury. The amusement park suspended Ferris wheel operations indefinitely. Local regulators mandated an independent mechanical inspection before reopening. Arman's funeral drew over 50 mourners from his neighborhood and workplace. It was October 14th, 2015, and the Smoky Mountains were deep into fall. The leaves had turned. The air had that cool bite to it once the sun dropped, and Pigeon Forge was doing what it does every October. The town was packed. If you've never been, Pigeon Forge is one of those tourist strips in eastern Tennessee where every other building is either a pancake house, a go-kart track, or some kind of attraction. During fall events, the place comes alive at night with haunted houses, themed rides, and enough neon to light up the whole valley. Let me tell you about Daphne Cuff. Daphne was 27 years old and worked at a restaurant. Not management, not corporate, just the kind of steady serving job that pays the bills while you figure out the rest. She had come to Pigeon Forge that evening with a friend, and from what I've gathered, this was a casual trip. Just 2 people with a night off who wanted to enjoy the fall events before the season ended. The kind of evening where you don't plan much, you just walk around and see what looks fun. At some point, they decided to try a slow indoor dark ride. If you're not familiar, these are enclosed attractions where you sit in a car that moves along a track through themed rooms and tunnels. Dim lighting, props on the walls, sound effects. They're designed to be atmospheric, not fast. Daphne and her friend climbed into one of the cars and the ride began moving them through the enclosed tunnels. Now here's what neither of them knew. Earlier that evening, staff had reported flickering lights in one section of the ride. Wiring behind a prop wall had been overheating, but the decision was made to keep the attraction open. The ride continued running cycles while the issue went unaddressed. I keep coming back to this detail because it means someone looked at a known electrical problem inside an enclosed tunnel full of people and decided the money from a few more ride cycles was worth the risk. As their car moved deeper into the tunnels, the ride stopped. The emergency stop had been triggered by a power fault somewhere in the system. The lights went out. The car sat motionless in an enclosed section with no natural light and no ventilation. Other riders in cars ahead and behind them were in the same situation. Everyone was just sitting in the dark, waiting. An electrical short behind one of the prop walls ignited the insulation material inside the tunnel. In an enclosed space like that, it doesn't take much. The insulation began producing thick smoke that had nowhere to go because the ventilation fans were tied to the same power circuit. So when the system shut down, airflow stopped completely. There was no airflow moving through the tunnels. The smoke just accumulated. Reaching riders inside an enclosed, dark ride isn't simple. The tunnels are narrow, the track takes up most of the floor space, and without power, there's no lighting to navigate by. It took several minutes before staff were able to reach the section where Daphne's car had stopped. By that point, visibility inside the tunnel had dropped to almost nothing. Daphne's friend, who was sitting beside her, later confirmed that Daphne had stopped responding before the evacuation team arrived. She had collapsed inside the ride vehicle while the smoke filled the space around them. Fire crews ventilated the tunnel and removed riders. When they reached Daphne's car, she was unresponsive. Daphne Cuff was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was smoke inhalation. The investigation revealed the ride had continued operating after staff reported electrical problems earlier that evening. The overheating wiring was the source of the short that ignited the insulation. The ventilation system was tied to the same power supply that had tripped, meaning the moment the ride stopped was also the moment airflow stopped. The local operator was cited for leaving the attraction open after wiring problems had been reported. The ride stayed closed for the remainder of the fall event season. There was no dramatic moment in Daphne's story, no visible danger. She was sitting in a ride that had simply stopped moving. Most people in that situation would assume it's a minor delay. You sit, you wait, you expect the lights to come back on. She had no way of knowing that the air around her was slowly becoming unsurvivable. It was September 6, 2015, at a large lakeside amusement park in northern Ohio. The park was winding down for the evening, the midway emptying as families made their way toward the exits, and the food stalls began closing their shutters one by one. And something about stories that start during closing time always gets my attention, because by that point everyone assumes the day is basically over. Kevin Morales, 26, had worked as a ride operator at the park for 3 seasons. He had spent most of that summer on the wooden coaster at the far edge of the grounds, running cycles from open to close 6 days a week. He knew the ride well and had ridden it many times since starting the job. Boarding after closing never seemed unusual. That evening, 2 colleagues from nearby attractions asked if they could ride before the coaster was shut down for the night. Staff rides after closing were not unusual. The park was quiet and the queue was empty. A second operator took position at the control panel to dispatch the train. Kevin checked the lap bars, gave each one a tug, and took the front seat. And honestly, reading through this part of the timeline, everything about it feels completely routine. The wooden coaster was the oldest ride in the park, its tall timber supports rising above the trees at the far edge of the midway. By the end of summer, it had run thousands of cycles, the track rattling and groaning the way wooden coasters always do. Kevin knew the ride well. He had spent most of the season dispatching trains from the station and had ridden it many times after closing. That evening felt no different. The park was quiet, the queue empty, and the sun was beginning to drop behind the tree line as the train left the station. The lift chain pulled the cars slowly up the first hill. Kevin sat in the front seat, the wooden structure creaking around him as the ground fell away beneath the track. From the top, he could see the park stretching out in the evening light. Behind him, his 2 co-workers laughed as the train crested the hill and tipped forward into the first drop. The train raced through the opening hills, the structure shaking beneath the cars as it always did. Wooden coasters are supposed to feel rough, and nothing about the ride seemed unusual at first. But as the train approached the far turnaround, the vibration through the front car grew stronger. And this is the moment where the story starts to feel different. The impact came without warning. As the train entered the turn at full speed, the front wheels struck a misaligned section of track in the turn. The car lurched violently to the side and slammed into the wooden support beams beside the track. The entire train shuddered as the cars scraped along the track, the sound of wood and steel grinding together echoing through the framework. Kevin, seated in the front car with nothing ahead of him to absorb the force, took the full impact as the side of the car struck the structure. I need you to understand what that means. Front seat, nothing between him and the impact. He never had a chance. The train rolled onto the brake run and came to a stop before the station, the abnormal noise immediately catching the operator's attention. He triggered the emergency stop as the train rolled onto the brake run. Park security and emergency responders were already being called as the train came to a halt. 2 riders survived with serious injuries. Kevin Morales was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death as severe blunt force head trauma sustained during the lateral impact with the ride structure. In the days that followed, investigators examined the coaster and reviewed maintenance and incident records. And when I read what surfaced afterward, it was one of those details that just makes your stomach drop. An earlier guest complaint about the rough section of track had never been entered into the park's incident reporting system. The coaster was closed, pending a full structural review. It was May 27, 2015, at a county fair amusement park in Oklahoma. Dark storm clouds gathered on the western horizon as families moved along the busy midway. The air felt heavy with humidity while distant thunder rumbled, but rides were still operating as visitors rushed to enjoy the attractions while the storm approached from several miles away. Kestra Dwin, a 17-year-old high school junior and track team member, had come to the fair with 3 classmates after their school meet earlier that afternoon. Friends later said Kestra loved heights and rarely turned down a ride that climbed above the fairgrounds. As thunder echoed closer, she joked that filming lightning from the top of the Ferris wheel would make an incredible video, brushing off her friends' warnings and the ride operator's announcement, telling riders to remain seated and keep their hands inside the gondola. The 120-foot Ferris wheel stood as the fair's centerpiece, its steel frame painted in bright red and white stripes. Open metal gondolas swayed slightly in the strengthening wind as operators continued loading passengers while the sky darkened. Kestra and one friend climbed into an open gondola and sat on the metal bench as the wheel began its slow rotation. The gondola had simple side rails but no overhead protection. As they rose higher, wind gusts rocked the gondola more noticeably, causing the suspended car to sway gently back and forth. When their gondola reached roughly 100 feet above the ground, the wheel paused to load passengers below. Instead of staying seated, Kestra stood up inside the gondola and leaned over the rail to film the lightning forming in the distance. To steady herself against the wind, she gripped 2 separate metal bars of the gondola frame with both hands while holding her phone out over the side. Lightning flickered in the approaching storm as the cell moved closer to the fairgrounds. Several people on the midway glanced nervously toward the darkening sky, while others continued riding, assuming the storm was still some distance away. A lightning strike hit near the upper steel frame of the Ferris wheel, sending electrical current through parts of the structure. The electrical current spread through the spokes and support structure, traveling downward along the ride's metal framework toward the ground. As the charge passed through the gondola mounting arm, a brief side flash arced between the energized bracket and the nearby rail that Kestra was gripping while standing over the side of the gondola recording the storm. Witnesses below saw a bright flash and sparks near the gondola bracket. The discharge passed across her hands and through her upper body for a split second before continuing into the ride's grounded frame. Kestra immediately collapsed sideways onto the bench. Small electrical burns marked her palms where the arc had contacted the metal rail. Her friend, who had remained seated away from the rails, was unharmed and began calling for help from their elevated position while signaling toward the operators below. Fairgoers on the ground alerted ride operators, who began manually rotating the wheel to bring the gondola down. The process took several minutes as each gondola had to be lowered in sequence, while the storm continued approaching and distant thunder grew louder. Emergency responders were waiting when the gondola finally reached ground level. They determined that the lightning discharge triggered a cardiac arrhythmia that caused Kestra to collapse after the current passed through her upper body during the strike. Witnesses later confirmed that Kestra had ignored instructions to remain seated and had stood up while gripping the exposed metal frame of the gondola to film the lightning storm from the top of the ride, a decision that placed her directly in the path of the electrical side flash. It was January 21st, 2018. The morning sun beat down on a water park on Australia's Gold Coast, where families lined up for slides and wave pools under cloudless skies. Martin Vale stood in line for the park's fastest water slide with 3 friends from his old club. Martin, 50, had spent 15 years playing semi-professional rugby for a coastal league team before retiring at 38 due to recurring knee injuries. His teammates remembered him as physically imposing and stubborn, someone who refused to tap out during training no matter how exhausted. Water slides operate on simple physics. Gravity accelerates riders down angled chutes, while water reduces friction, with speed controlled by slide angle and rider position. Park regulations required all riders to go feet first to prevent head and neck injuries, with multiple signs posted at every slide entrance. The 200-foot slide Martin was queuing for reached speeds of approximately 38 miles per hour, ending in a shallow run-out trough designed to slow riders before they reached the catch pool. That afternoon, Martin and his friends had been drinking beer since noon at the poolside bar. By 2:15 in the afternoon, they reached the slide platform. Martin loudly announced to his group that he would go head first like he had done at smaller slides earlier that day, ignoring the prominent feet first only signs posted at eye level. The teenage attendant attempted to stop Martin, but he ignored the instruction entirely, stepping into the lane before the attendant could intervene further. Platform CCTV later showed Martin move into the lane, and ride sensor logs confirmed a momentary fault in the dispatch interlock that day. Martin positioned himself head first at the slide entrance, arms extended forward like a swimmer. Without waiting for the attendant's clearance signal, he pushed off forcefully, launching himself into the enclosed tube. His friends later told investigators they assumed the attendant had approved the launch. Martin accelerated rapidly down the steep sections, water pressure forcing his head lower as he picked up speed. Entering the run-out trough at approximately 38 miles per hour, his streamlined position prevented the natural slowdown that other riders experienced. His low head position caused his forehead to strike the fiberglass floor of the trough during deceleration, forcing his neck into a sudden forward compression. The impact stopped his forward head momentum, but his 220-pound body continued sliding forward, driving his face along the trough bottom for another 15 feet. Witnesses in the catch pool area saw Martin's body slide face down into the shallow water, arms floating limply at his sides. He made no attempt to lift his head or roll over. Water entered his mouth and nose as he floated motionless in 3 feet of water. The lifeguard reached him within 20 seconds, held his head and neck rigid while rolling him supine onto a rescue board, began rescue breathing and chest compressions, and had a defibrillator on scene within a minute. Martin showed no voluntary respiratory effort. He showed no visible response as rescuers continued emergency care. The lifeguard radioed for emergency services while continuing rescue protocols. He was transported to a regional hospital, where imaging revealed catastrophic brainstem injury from the initial impact and secondary hypoxic brain damage from water aspiration and oxygen deprivation. Martin remained on life support for 14 days, while physicians conducted multiple neurological assessments. All tests showed complete absence of brain activity. His family authorized withdrawal of mechanical ventilation on February 4, 2018. The coroner listed cause of death as severe hypoxic brain injury, secondary to blunt force head trauma and drowning. The water park temporarily closed the slide for investigation. Investigators reviewed CCTV footage, sensor logs, and bar service records. Ride attendants underwent mandatory retraining, emphasizing strict enforcement of dispatch procedures, rider positioning rules, and alcohol policies.